They say every legend begins with a whisper, something that lingers on the edge of memory, too strange to be forgotten, too beautiful to be true. Tonight we're going to follow one of those whispers. It begins not in the sea, but in the quiet of your own room, in this very moment, a story about a world that once gleamed like a mirror to the gods and then vanished beneath the waves. Hey there, friend. Welcome back to Candlelit History. I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop, maybe dim the lights, or light a candle if you have one nearby. Let the room soften, maybe turn on a gentle fan or open the window a crack, just enough for the cool night air to move. The goal, as always, isn't just to listen, it's to drift. If you're new here, this is a space for calm stories, history told slowly, for curious minds who don't mind falling asleep halfway through. If you've been with us before, welcome home. I love imagining where people are listening from. Maybe you're in a city apartment where car lights slide across the wall, or in a quiet house by the sea, or in a dorm room where the glow of a single lamp keeps the world small and warm. Wherever you are, you're part of a circle now, a little world held together by candlelight, curiosity, and the simple comfort of stories. Tonight's story is one that has haunted the human imagination for more than 2,000 years. It's about a city that was said to have been too perfect for its own good. A city of concentric rings, rich metals, and sacred laws. A civilization born from the hands of a god and lost, perhaps by its own pride. The legend of Atlantis. You've probably heard the word before. Maybe it brings to mind marble temples, golden halls, and white ships gliding across a blue horizon. Or maybe you think of lost maps and submarine expeditions, or the wild theories that fill documentaries and late-night podcasts. But beneath all those images lies something older, quieter, and stranger. A moral story told by a philosopher, written not to dazzle us, but to teach us something about what it means to forget who we are. And that's where we begin. The waves you might hear, soft and rhythmic, they are not the waves of destruction just yet. These are the waves of creation. Imagine the Aegean Sea around 360 BCE, its surface turning gold under a low sun. Athens hums with the sound of students and teachers, of traders, of the slow rhythm of a city thinking itself into the future. In one corner of that world, a man sits under an olive tree, quill in hand, writing words that would outlive empires. His name is Plato. Plato had seen the rise and fall of Athens, its brilliance and its hubris. He had watched democracy twist into ambition, and ambition into ruin. He had seen wisdom and arrogance share the same face, and so he began to write a dialogue, a conversation meant to hold a mirror to his own people. In it he spoke of a world far older than Greece, a world across the sea, one that had once been great, but had fallen through greed and excess. He called it Atlantis. To his students it was a myth told for meaning. To later generations, it became a mystery too vivid to let go. And to us, tonight it's a lullaby woven from philosophy and sea mist. So let's begin the slow descent. Not downward but backward, through time. Before marble, before empire, before the first name was carved into stone. Imagine the earth young again, the sky low and heavy with salt, the sea full of light and silence. Somewhere beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, what ancient sailors called the Pillars of Heracles, lies an island so vast and fertile that it gleams like a jewel in the ocean's crown. They said it was a land of warm springs and cold rivers, where the soil gave freely and the trees never forgot to bear fruit. At its center rose a low hill of red earth, and there, according to the story, a mortal woman lived. Cleito, the last of her noble line. She kept her father's house alone, in quiet dignity, and when the sea god Poseidon looked upon that hill, he fell in love with her, but that's for later. Right now I want you to imagine the feeling of distance, the kind that only the ocean can make, a horizon that never ends, the hum of wind and tide, the faint shimmer of lightning far away, where the sea meets the night sky. That's where Atlantis lives, somewhere between reality and dream, between the pages of a philosopher and the sound of the sea. So as we drift together into this story, think of it not as a hunt for proof, but as a kind of journey inward, through the history of belief, the architecture of myth, and the quiet human longing for paradise lost. If you enjoy these kinds of calm explorations, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, only if it feels right for you. It helps this little candle burn a bit longer in the dark, and it means we can spend more nights like this together. Now settle in, the waves will do the rest. Let their rhythm slow your heartbeat. Picture the candle's flame, how it leans slightly one way, then another, never hurried. That's the rhythm of the world we're entering. In a moment we'll cross the threshold, from the philosopher's desk to the divine island he described. We'll watch as the sea god walks the earth, shaping the red hill into circles of land and water. We'll see the city rise, radiant and ordered, under his hand. But for now, just breathe. The night is long, and the story has only just begun. The year is around 360 BCE. In a courtyard shaded by olive trees, the city of Athens breathes and argues in equal measure. The cicadas drone like a soft chorus, and the air smells faintly of oil lamps and wet clay. Somewhere in that golden hush, a philosopher lifts his head from a scroll. His name is Plato, and the thought that fills his mind tonight will echo for millennia. Plato was not a man of myths, at least not in the way poets were. He used stories like instruments, meant to tune the soul. His teacher Socrates had taught him that wisdom begins in questions, in the restless search for truth through dialogue. And so Plato wrote in voices, his own, his teachers, his cities. But there was one voice that was always half in shadow, the one that spoke of a place beyond memory, beyond the known world. That voice told of Atlantis. He introduces it quietly, in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In them he writes that the story of Atlantis came from the Egyptian priests of Sais, passed down through the Greek lawgiver Solon, who had once journeyed to the Nile seeking wisdom. The priests, he said, told Solon that Athens was far older than it believed, that long before its founding, there had been another great power across the sea, a kingdom rich, wise, and vast, whose name had been forgotten by all but the gods, Atlantis. Plato describes it not as a fable, but as a record, a true story, he insists, written in the sacred books of Egypt. And in the candlelight of his imagination, he begins to paint its form. The island, he writes, lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the boundless Atlantic Ocean. It was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, and from it one could pass to other islands, and from those to a whole continent beyond, a continent across the sea. Imagine what that sounded like to the ancient world, to Plato's students, gathered in the quiet of his academy. The tale must have felt both impossible and electric. The world they knew ended at the edges of the Mediterranean, where the ocean widened into mystery. Beyond that was nothing, or everything. But Plato was not writing a sailor's log. His Atlantis was not a place you could map. It was a mirror. He used it to explore the difference between divine order and human corruption, between a society ruled by virtue and one ruled by pride. According to his telling, Atlantis was once the greatest of nations, born from the god Poseidon himself. Its kings were half divine, half mortal, bound by sacred law to rule with justice. The city's wealth came not from conquest, but from the harmony of its people and the gifts of its land. There were canals that gleamed like silver threads, harbors deep and calm, temples built from three kinds of stone, white, black, and red. The walls were lined with auriculcum, a metal said to shine like fire. In the beginning they worshipped Poseidon in reverence. They offered the first fruits of their fields, the finest of their bulls. Their hearts were humble, their laws strong, but over generations the divine blood began to thin, and mortal greed began to grow. That, Plato warned, is where perfection begins to crumble. He wrote that the kings of Atlantis, once wise and disciplined, fell into arrogance. They began to hunger for more land, more wealth, more glory. They built ships that carried armies to the shores of the Mediterranean. They waged war against Egypt and Greece, and even sought to subdue Athens itself. But Athens, in his tale, stood firm, guided by virtue and divine favor. It repelled the invaders. The proud Atlanteans, stunned by their defeat, retreated home, and soon after, their island was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. The earth shook, and the waters rose. Plato writes, "The island of Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. For centuries, readers have wondered whether he meant it literally. Was Atlantis a moral parable, a caution against pride, or was it an echo of something real, something remembered dimly from a forgotten time?" Some later thinkers would call it pure allegory. Others would search maps and ocean floors for proof. But for Plato, the truth of the story lived not in geography, but in meaning. In the candlelit hush of his academy, he invited his listeners to see Atlantis not as a lost island, but as a reflection of themselves. Every society, he seemed to say, carries both Athens and Atlantis within it, order and temptation, balance and excess. And the sea that swallows one is the same tide that shapes the other. As the night deepened, his students likely drifted between thought and reverie, hearing the rhythm of his voice like waves against stone. Maybe even then, the first myth took root, the image of a city too perfect to endure, resting somewhere below the horizon of memory. But here's where the story turns. In Critias, Plato promised to tell the full tale, how Atlantis was formed, how it was divided among the 10 kings, how the sons of Poseidon built their temples and walls and canals. But the dialogue breaks off mid-sentence. The last words we have are fragments, a thought cut short, a city left half-remembered. No one knows why. Did Plato die before finishing it, or did he mean to leave it incomplete? A mystery to haunt the curious. The world may never know, but tonight we can pick up where he left off. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the sea stretching westward from Greece, farther and farther, until the known world falls away. The stars overhead burn cold and ancient. The air smells of salt and thunder. And there, at the edge of the world, the first light breaks across the waves, revealing an island, vast, green and alive. In the next chapter, we'll walk its shores. We'll see the red hill where Plato lived, and the god who fell in love with her. We'll watch the sea itself bend to divine will, circling the land in rings of water and light. The story of Atlantis is about to begin, not as a theory, not as a metaphor, but as a world reborn before your eyes. They say the gods once walked the earth not as shadows or symbols, but as forces that could be felt, in the rumble of the tide, in the stillness after thunder, in the breath of the sea itself. And among them, none loved the mortal world more fiercely than Poseidon, the god of the ocean's depths, the shaker of the earth, the bringer of both calm and ruin. It is said that his heart was caught not by a kingdom or a temple, but by a single hill on a lonely island, and by the woman who lived upon it. Beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the Atlantic opened wide and wild, there lay an island vast and rich. The sailors who glimpsed it in passing said it shimmered with strange light, as though the air itself were touched by something sacred. In its center rose a red hill of clay and stone, small enough to walk across in an afternoon, yet high enough to catch the first breath of dawn and the last whisper of dusk. Upon that hill lived Plato, the daughter of Evenor, a man of noble blood and quiet wisdom, and of Leucippe, who was said to have been as fair as sea foam at sunrise. Plato lived alone after her parents passed, tending the groves and the springs her father had loved. She was a woman of solitude, the last of her line, content to hear only the wind in the cedars and the sigh of the tide against the rocks. But one evening, as the sun sank into the western sea, the world shifted. A wind rose from the deep, carrying with it the scent of salt and storm. The waves drew back, then fell again in long, even breaths. From the foam stepped Poseidon. The god's eyes, the poet said, held the green of 1,000 waters, calm one moment, unfathomable the next. When he saw Plato upon that red hill, he did not speak at first. The earth itself seemed to still, listening for what he might do, and then, moved by love or fate, or something older than either, Poseidon reached out his trident and struck the land. The ground quivered, the rivers shuddered, and the sea came rushing inward, not to drown, but to shape. He circled the hill with his power, carving deep moats of blue water, and lifting rings of fertile earth between them. The god worked as a craftsman, cutting channels with divine precision, until the island glimmered in perfect symmetry. 3 rings of sea, and 2 of land, each encircling the next like ripples frozen in time. At the center stood Plato's hill, now an island within an island, unreachable by mortal hand unless Poseidon himself permitted it. When his work was done, Poseidon breathed upon the land, and springs burst forth, one warm as sunlight, one cold as moonlight. The warm spring steamed gently in the morning air, carrying the scent of minerals and life. The cold one ran clear and sweet, feeding streams that wound through groves of fig and pomegranate. It was said that the two waters never mingled, yet both gave strength to all who drank from them. Even the bread baked from the grain grown in their irrigation was said to taste richer, touched by the god's blessing. In that sacred grove, Poseidon built a home for Plato. He raised walls of white stone that caught the dawn and glowed like bone beneath the stars. He roofed it with cedar and bronze, and around it he planted trees whose branches never withered, bearing fruit in every season. There the god and the mortal woman dwelled together, and from their union came 10 sons born in 5 pairs, each radiant with the vigor of the sea and the strength of the earth. The eldest of them was Atlas, tall and solemn, whose voice carried across the waters like the echo of a conch shell. Poseidon gave him the central hill as his inheritance, and from his name the island itself became known as Atlantis, and the boundless ocean that wrapped its coasts took his name as well, the Atlantic. To his 9 brothers, the god granted the surrounding lands, each bound by law to serve their eldest brother with loyalty and reverence. It was a kingdom divided by order, not rivalry, a circle of blood and balance. Under Poseidon's eye the island flourished. The earth was dark and fertile. Barley rose thick and golden in the wind. Vines climbed trellises heavy with grapes that glimmered like garnets. The forests were full of tall pines and sweet cedar. The fields were laced with canals that carried water to every crop. The land gave so freely that men began to wonder whether the island itself was alive, whether its pulse beat with the same rhythm as the sea. Atlas ruled wisely, and for a time the people lived as their father had wished, humbly in harmony with their gods and with the gifts of the earth. They built no walls of pride, only shrines, small temples with altars of white stone, where the first fruits of the harvest were laid, and prayers were whispered to the sea. Their gold and their red metal, which they called orichalcum, were not yet tools of vanity, but of devotion. The first pillar of the city bore their laws, written in words of fire: live justly, remember your father, honor the sea. And yet beneath all this peace, something subtle stirred, for where abundance settles, ambition begins to wake. The sons of Poseidon were not mortals, but neither were they gods, and even in the blood of the divine, pride is a patient seed. Years passed, and the island grew strong. Ships began to cross the outer waters, bringing goods, stories, and strangers. The Atlanteans were generous traders, yet they guarded their center, that sacred hill where the springs still whispered in their mother's grove. No visitor set foot there. The bridges that crossed the rings could be raised in moments, and when they were, the waters circled like sentinels, deep and still. Even as the kingdom expanded, that center remained inviolate, a reminder that the divine gift must be kept apart from greed. It's said that Poseidon watched from the depths, proud but wary, for though his sons ruled well, the day would come when their temples would gleam too brightly, and their hearts would harden like stone. The gods, after all, do not grant paradise without purpose. Every gift is also a test. Tonight, as you listen, imagine the island at dusk, the rings glinting with bronze light, the air thick with the smell of salt and cedar. Somewhere near the central spring, a young prince walks the path between the trees, tracing the carvings on the pillar of law. His father, Atlas, speaks of justice and patience, of the balance between taking and giving. The boy nods, though his eyes drift toward the horizon, where distant sails gleam like silver. Beyond those waves lie other lands, other peoples, other treasures, and deep within him, a question begins to grow, one that no law can silence forever. What happens when paradise forgets who built it? That is where the cracks begin, and it is there, in the faint tremor beneath the calm, that the true story of Atlantis will turn. In the next part, we'll walk through the city they built, the bridges, the temples, the canals, and see how beauty itself can become a warning. Morning broke over the island like a benediction. The sunlight fell across the rings of water and earth that Poseidon had shaped, setting them aglow in shades of gold and crimson. The air shimmered with mist from the warm spring that ran through Clyto's grove, and every blade of grass seemed to hum softly with life. The god had given the world a perfect design, and now his sons were to fill it with motion, to turn a divine pattern into a living city. Atlas, eldest of the 10, stood upon the red hill that was once his mother's home. Around him stretched the rings, vast circles of land and sea, each reflecting the other like the grooves of a shell. He felt the weight of his father's law, the echo of his voice still thrumming in his blood. Keep the center pure, Poseidon had told him. Build not to impress the heavens, but to honor them. And so the first city began. The brothers gathered workers from the outer villages, craftsmen from the mountain valleys, and sailors from the coasts. Under Atlas's command, they began shaping bridges across the water rings, broad enough for carts and chariots, but light enough to lift in moments of danger. The work was slow, deliberate, almost reverent. No hammer struck without prayer, no foundation stone was laid without the blessing of the springs. Soon the heart of Atlantis began to rise, not in arrogance, but in beauty. The central ring became a sacred precinct, its walls built from the white stone that caught the morning light and seemed to breathe. Around it, the next circle was lined with red stone and black basalt, forming graceful bands of color that rippled around the island like a painted horizon. The architects discovered 3 kinds of stone on the island, white as moonlight, red as dawn, and black as nightfall. They built with all 3, weaving them together in patterns that made the city look alive, as though it were part of the earth itself, not imposed upon it. The outermost walls were faced with polished bronze that glowed in the sun. The middle walls gleamed with pale tin, and the innermost shone with auricolcum, the red gold metal that never dulled, even in sea air. When the light struck those walls at sunrise, the whole island seemed to blaze. Sailors approaching from the open sea would pause at their oars, staring at the shimmer of color and metal that crowned the waves. They said Atlantis looked not like a city, but like a reflection of the sky. Within the inner circle, Atlas ordered the construction of a great temple, not to himself, but to Poseidon and Clyto. It was larger than any building the people had ever seen, yet it held a kind of grace that made it feel smaller than the sea. The temple's columns were sheathed in the red metal, their capitals carved with the shapes of dolphins and bulls. The roof beams were made of cedar, brought down from the high forests, each one so perfectly cut that they fit together without a sound. Inside, the walls gleamed with ivory and gold. At the far end of the temple stood a statue of Poseidon in a chariot, drawn by 6 horses that seemed to leap out of the stone itself. Around his feet, the sculptors carved the 10 kings taking their oaths before him. Beneath the temple floor, they raised an altar of white marble, where the priests poured libations of wine and oil. The scent filled the air each evening, mingling with salt from the sea. There was no fear in their worship, only reverence, a sense that the god still walked the island in spirit, watching as his sons shaped the world he had given them. The city's design reflected that divine order. From the temple, straight roads radiated outward like spokes, crossing the bridges and leading to the outer lands. Between the roads ran canals that glistened with clear water, carrying small boats laden with grain and fruit. Every ring had its own life. The inner circle for the kings and their councils, the middle for the craftsmen and priests, and the outermost for the traders, farmers, and sailors. On the far edge of the city, where the rings met the open sea, Atlas ordered the digging of a great canal, a passage wide enough for ships with high prows to sail straight into the heart of Atlantis. The canal was lined with stone, its walls carved with patterns of waves and sea creatures. At night, torches burned along its length, so that from above it looked like a river of fire cutting through the dark. The harbor it fed became the lungs of the city. Ships came and went on the tide, bringing goods from nearby islands and distant shores. Fishermen carried baskets of gleaming silver fish to the market. Traders unloaded amber, spices, and strange metals from lands no Atlantean had ever seen. The markets grew noisy with barter, laughter, and the clang of coin. Yet even in their growing wealth, the people remembered the old rule that every 10th coin belonged to the temple, every 10th jar of oil, every 10th loaf of bread. Life in the city followed the rhythm of the sea. At dawn the fishermen pushed off in long narrow boats, the smell of salt sharp in their lungs. At midday, Merchants spread cloths beneath the colonnades, displaying goods in neat rows of color. By evening, the priests lit lamps along the causeways, and families walked to the precinct to give thanks for another day without storm. It was a world built not for speed, but for harmony, every task fitting neatly into the next. For a while, it seemed as though Atlantis had achieved what no mortal realm ever could, a perfect balance between power and peace. The sons of Poseidon ruled as kings, yet they ruled together, each bound by oath to the others. When disputes arose, they gathered in the temple beneath the red glow of the orichalcum walls. They hunted a bull in the sacred court, and over its blood they swore to uphold the laws inscribed on the great pillar of gold. They judged one another not by wealth or flattery, but by the measure of their duty. And for generations the island flourished. The fields gave in plenty, the harbours overflowed, the canals ran clear, and the people sang songs of gratitude to the god who had blessed them. But perfection, like the tide, has its turn. The very wealth that had been a gift began to glimmer with temptation. The red metal, once sacred, found its way into bracelets, mirrors, and crowns. The pillars that bore the laws of humility began to stand beside halls lined with treasure. Atlas still kept the faith. But beyond the inner rings, his brothers began to dream of more, of ships that could cross oceans, of cities built not by divine order, but by human pride. And in the deep chambers of the sea, far below the light, something began to stir. The god who had once smiled upon the island felt the shift in its pulse. The balance he had carved in rings of earth and water was beginning to tremble, faintly, almost imperceptibly, like the first ripple before a wave. The city shone brighter than ever. But sometimes, the brightest light comes just before the storm. In the next part, we'll walk through the daily life of Atlantis at its height, its harvests, its festivals, its markets, and watch how prosperity slowly, silently, began to turn. At the height of its glory, Atlantis no longer looked like a kingdom built by men. It gleamed like something half-remembered from the dreams of the gods. From above, its rings of land and sea looked alive, moving with the rhythm of tides and trade. The sound of water ran through its streets like blood through veins. The air smelled of salt, crushed grain, and cedar. Everything, from the smallest stone bridge to the largest temple wall, felt deliberate, as though creation itself had taken a slow, measured breath and decided to rest here. Outside the city's rings stretched a vast plain, green and gold beneath the sun, flat enough to see for miles. Canals cut through it like ribbons of blue, guiding water from the mountains to the sea. Along their banks, farmers bent over the soil, hands dark with earth, planting barley and wheat in perfect rows. Each field was measured with care, aligned so that every furrow caught the morning light and the afternoon breeze. The Atlanteans believed that the gods could read the patterns of their work from the sky, that beauty itself was a form of prayer. When harvest came, it was more than an act of labor. It was a ceremony. The first sheaves were carried to the temple at dawn, where the priests sang hymns in the old language, words so ancient that even they did not know their full meaning. Then the gates of the outer rings opened, and the people poured in. The streets filled with music, drums, and laughter. The scent of roasting fish and honeyed bread drifted through the air. Children danced around the bridges, tossing flower garlands into the water, watching them float away like small blessings. The people of Atlantis were not idle in their wealth. They were builders, artisans, and thinkers. Stonemasons carved the faces of gods into the sides of bridges, while blacksmiths worked the red orichalcum into fine tools and ornaments. The metal, unique to their land, shone like captured sunlight. A cup made of it was said never to tarnish, no matter how many years passed. The finest pieces, rings, blades, statues, were set aside for the temple. Others found their way into homes and markets, symbols of a society that believed prosperity could exist without greed. Trade moved like breath through the veins of the city. Ships from the harbor crossed the outer sea, returning with spices from warm southern lands and amber from the cold northern coasts. The canals bustled with smaller boats that carried grain, timber, and cloth from one ring to the next. Every sound in Atlantis, the clatter of oars, the thud of cartwheels, the low murmur of markets, was its own kind of harmony. The people had learned to live in rhythm with what the sea allowed, and for a time, that rhythm held. Even their animals seemed to thrive. Herds grazed along the foothills, their coats sleek and strong, horses trained on the wide racecourse that circled the outer wall, their hooves drumming against packed sand in thunderous unison. On festival days, the kings themselves would watch from raised stands, their crowns simple yet radiant in the light. The races were more than sport, they were lessons in precision, reminders that strength meant nothing without control. The city's engineers, perhaps the true heirs of Poseidon's gift, wove cleverness into every part of daily life. They built aqueducts that carried clean water from the mountains to the baths, fountains, and homes. Beneath the streets, drains ran deep, carrying away rainwater so that no storm could flood the rings. The people often said that their island breathed, exhaling when the tide fell, inhaling when it rose. In the schools near the inner ring, children learned not only letters and numbers, but the laws of harmony. They were taught to draw the shape of their island from memory, the 5 rings of land and water, each representing an order of life. The center was sacred, the home of gods and kings. The next ring was the realm of law and craft. Beyond that were the markets and the harbors, the pulse of trade, then the farmlands and forests, the outer skin of the realm, and beyond it all, the endless sea, their eternal teacher and judge. The Atlanteans believed that understanding this pattern, this geometry of being, kept the world in balance. Every choice, they said, should echo the shape of the island, a circle that returns to its beginning. For years that belief held them steady. Evenings in Atlantis carried their own kind of grace. As the sun dipped behind the outer wall, the sea turned molten, and the canals mirrored the fading sky. Lamps were lit one by one, until the city glowed like an ember cradled in darkness. Families gathered in courtyards, eating olives, bread and fruit beneath the flicker of oil lamps. Musicians played soft songs that spoke of the sea's moods, gentle, dangerous, endless. And in the precinct at the island's heart, the priests walked barefoot across the marble floor, tending to the sacred fires that never went out. The High King, Atlas, would often walk alone at night through the inner ring, listening to the sound of running water. He would pause by the springs, one warm, one cold, and place his hands in both, feeling their difference. One comforted, the other awakened. To him they were symbols of the balance his father had demanded. He believed, perhaps naively, that his people could hold that balance forever. But as the years passed, small signs began to appear, the kind that most would have ignored. Traders returning from far journeys spoke with envy of other lands, of resources untapped, of cities ripe for alliance or conquest. Some princes began to argue for greater fleets, stronger armies, wider borders. The outer rings, once humble and quiet, began to glitter at night with torches and feasts. Wine flowed freely, and so did ambition. Atlas noticed the change. Though he said little, he knew that the strength of Atlantis was not in its gold or its ships, but in its discipline, in the invisible threads that tied its circles together. Yet he could feel those threads loosening, one by one. There was a night, not written in any record, but whispered in later ages, when the sea grew strangely still. The stars hung low and bright, reflected perfectly on the surface of the canals. The priests said it was an omen, though none could agree what it meant. The next morning a tremor ran through the island, faint, brief, gone as quickly as it came. The farmers thought it was the earth stretching in its sleep. The fishermen thought it was a whale far below. Only the old ones, those who still remembered the god's voice in the wind, looked toward the horizon and said nothing. For all its glory, the island had begun to shift, not in its stones or its waters, but in its heart. The balance that had once seemed eternal was tilting, ever so slightly, toward pride, and pride in the world of men and gods alike is a fault line waiting to break. In the next part we'll descend from the shimmering temples to the pillar of law, the orichalcum tablet, where the kings of Atlantis carved their covenant with the sea. There, under the watchful eyes of Poseidon, they will make a vow that will bind them, and one day destroy them. At the very center of Atlantis, where the inner ring met the hill of Plato, stood a pillar unlike any other in the world. It gleamed even in shadow. A single column of red orichalcum, that rose from the marble floor of Poseidon's precinct, carved so precisely it seemed to hum when the wind passed through the temple doors. Around its base, the ground was smooth from centuries of footsteps. It was here, under the eyes of their father's statue, that the 10 kings of Atlantis gathered to renew their oaths. They called it the Pillar of Law. It held no crown or weapon, only words. Etched into the glowing metal in clear, ancient script were the commandments of Poseidon himself, that justice must rule above strength, that no king could make war upon another without consent of all, that the sacred springs and the central hill must remain untouched by greed or vanity. The pillar reminded them that power was only ever alone from the divine, and that what the sea had given, the sea could take away. The ritual began at dawn, every 6th year, and again on the 5th. The kings approached barefoot, their heads crowned with fresh branches cut from the sacred grove. Each carried a simple staff of olive wood, a sign that their authority came not from conquest but from stewardship. The priests walked before them, scattering petals into the water. The people gathered in silence along the bridges, watching the reflections of the kings ripple in the canals below. When the horns sounded, the High King Atlas stepped forward. His robe was plain wool, bound with a strip of red metal. He placed his hand upon the pillar, and the others followed, one by one, until the circle of brothers stood complete. Then came the hunt. It was an old rite, older than the city itself. A bull would be chosen, not a penned beast, but one that roamed free on the plain. The kings would pursue it with spears and nets, testing their courage against the creature's strength. It was said that Poseidon watched through the bull's eyes, judging not who struck the final blow, but who showed restraint. When the hunt ended, the kings carried the sacrifice back to the temple. Its blood poured over the steps of the pillar. The scent of iron and salt filled the air, mingling with the smoke of cedar. Kneeling there, with the god's image towering above them, they swore their vows aloud. Each pledged to uphold the laws as written, to defend the weak, and to judge even their brothers if duty required it. Those who broke the oath would be cast from the inner ring and stripped of their portion of land. Exile in Atlantis was not merely punishment, it was erasure, a slow fading from memory. The ceremony bound the island in invisible threads. Every law, every custom, every coin minted in Atlantis carried the weight of that oath. The pillar was both symbol and warning. Justice must flow, like the water in the canals, from the center outward. If it ever ran backward, if kings sought to serve themselves before the realm, the balance would shatter. For many years the vows held. Under Atlas's watch, the island thrived. Disputes were settled in the temple's hall of judgment, where light fell through latticed windows and danced across the floor. The kings spoke calmly, listening before they ruled, and when they disagreed, they bowed to the wisdom of the majority. There was order in their council, like music played on 10 strings that never clashed. But the gods have long memories, and they know how time wears even the strongest stone. Slowly, the red metal on the pillar began to darken, dulled by the breath of men and the passing of seasons. The priests polished it daily, yet they could not restore its first brilliance. They said the metal was not fading, it was absorbing, that every unspoken doubt, every selfish thought sank into it like water into clay. The pillar was recording the truth behind the words. Outside the temple, signs of change multiplied. The younger kings, sons and grandsons of the first rulers, began to chafe under the old restrictions. They envied Atlas's central power, his access to the sacred springs and the treasury of the temple. Some began hosting feasts that rivaled the ceremonies themselves, tables heavy with meat and gold, musicians playing through the night while torches turned the canals into molten light. The priests muttered that Poseidon's law was being forgotten. The merchants, however, grew rich, and the people, dazzled by wealth, stopped asking questions. It was easy to believe that prosperity itself was proof of divine favor. One evening, when the wind came warm from the west and the sea lay still, the kings gathered once more in the temple, but this time the air felt different. The scent of incense was stronger than usual, heavy enough to hide the faint tang of salt beneath it. Atlas, older now, stood before the pillar and began to speak the traditional vow. His voice was steady, but as he finished, one of his brothers, Menesius, ruler of the southern ring, hesitated before placing his hand upon the metal. "My king," he said softly, "the world beyond our walls grows wider. Should we not meet it as equals to the gods who first made us?" The others shifted uneasily. Atlas turned to him, his gaze calm but sharp. "We are not gods, brother. We are caretakers. The sea gave us this order. To break it is to invite its return." Menesius smiled faintly, his fingers brushing the pillar. "Then perhaps the sea should learn how well its gift has been improved." A murmur rippled through the hall, quiet but deep. No one spoke further, yet something invisible cracked between them. A hairline fracture in unity. The pillar seemed to catch the tension, the red metal flickering with reflected torchlight. Some swore later that it pulsed, as if answering a sound no mortal ear could hear. After that day, the meetings grew shorter. The kings came less willingly. Each began to rule his own province with greater independence, still paying tribute to the center, but with pride swelling beneath obedience. The sacred bull hunts became ceremony without meaning. The blood dried on the steps faster than before. The pillar remained, shining faintly through the years, a monument to promises that men no longer feared to break. And somewhere deep below the temple, where the warm and cold springs met in hidden channels, a tremor passed through the stone. The earth groaned, just once, then settled again. Few noticed. The priests said it was nothing. The people went on with their feasts and their trading, and their prayers for calm weather. But the sea does not forget. It waits patient and endless, for the moment when men mistake silence for forgiveness, and one day soon, the silence would end. In the next part, we'll rise to the height of Atlantis's power, its golden age, when the city shone brighter than any kingdom on earth. We'll see how abundance turned to pride, and how pride began to whisper of conquest. For 100 years and more, after the first kings took their vows before the pillar, Atlantis stood as the envy of the world. Its harbors gleamed with ships, whose sails were dyed in deep blue and red, their prows carved in the shapes of horses and bulls. The docks were never silent. The creak of ropes, the slap of water against hulls, the rhythm of hammers striking bronze echoed through the outer ring from dawn to dusk. Everywhere there was motion, purpose, and pride. The plain beyond the city had grown into a marvel of order. From high above, the canals cut it into perfect rectangles, glinting in the sunlight like veins of silver. Water moved through them with measured precision, fed by the mountain springs that Poseidon himself had blessed. In the fields, teams of oxen pulled plows that gleamed with the red metal of the island's heart. Farmers worked in silence, their movements slow and practiced, each gesture inherited from 1,000 fathers before them. The mountains, too, gave generously. Miners descended into shafts that glowed faintly from the torches fixed to the walls. They brought out copper, tin, and black stone that could be sharpened to an edge fine enough to split hair. The red orichalcum was rarer, found deep beneath the earth, near the roots of the island's fire. When it was struck with a hammer, it sang like a bell. When polished, it held the color of sunset long after the sun was gone. The kings guarded the mines fiercely, for that metal was not just treasure, it was identity. Atlantis itself seemed to pulse with its hue. At the heart of the city, the temple of Poseidon rose higher than ever. Its columns, plated in the glowing metal, shone like flames when dawn touched them. The temple's roof was gilded with sheets of pale tin that reflected light across the canals and into the streets below. The statues inside were colossal, gods and heroes carved so finely that veins seemed to run beneath their marble skin. The scent of incense never left the air. Pilgrims came from far-off islands to see the holy precinct, to lay flowers at the steps or pour a libation of wine upon the white stones. The kings of Atlantis, though bound by law, grew into symbols of divine favor. Their council met in a great hall paved with blue stone, its ceiling painted with constellations. There, Atlas presided from a seat not of gold, but of carved cedar, his hands resting upon a staff capped with orichalcum. Beneath him, his brothers took their places according to rank, and when they spoke, the walls themselves seemed to listen. The oldest songs said that Poseidon's voice still echoed faintly in that chamber, carried in the vibration of the red pillar buried deep within the temple's foundations. Trade flowed outward like the sea itself. The Atlanteans became masters of navigation. They studied the stars, charted the currents, and built ships that could cross the open ocean with ease. Their merchants returned from every horizon bearing wonders: amber from the north, ivory from Africa, silk and spices from lands whispered of but never seen. They brought these riches into the outer markets, where traders spoke a dozen languages, and gold changed hands faster than rain fell. With trade came knowledge. The scholars of Atlantis recorded the movements of planets, the rise and fall of tides, and the hidden workings of the human body. They built schools near the temple where children studied not only arithmetic and geometry, but the harmonies of sound, color, and proportion, the laws, they believed, by which the gods themselves had built the world. To them, mathematics was a sacred language, each number a step toward the divine. In art and architecture, too, they excelled. Painters mixed mineral powders with oil and water to create colors that glowed in torchlight. Sculptors found ways to make marble appear translucent, catching shadows like skin. The builders perfected arches that could stand for centuries without mortar, using pressure alone to hold the stones in place. Even their fountains were feats of ingenuity, water that spouted in patterns of rhythm and music, rising and falling like breath. To outsiders, Atlantis appeared perfect, an empire without flaw, a civilization blessed by the gods, but beneath the beauty, something subtle was changing. The people had begun to forget the simplicity that once bound them. The festivals that had once honored Poseidon with quiet reverence grew louder, more extravagant. The sacred bull hunts became spectacles for sport rather than devotion. The king's robes, once plain, now glittered with jewels from distant lands. Atlas, now an old man, saw the shift but could not stop it. The younger kings, born into luxury, saw his caution as weakness. They no longer spoke of service but of destiny. The priests warned them that pride was the beginning of ruin, but their voices were drowned out by applause and music. The pillar of law still stood in the temple, but few read the inscriptions carved upon it. They passed it, as one passes a monument to a story half remembered. One year the island held a festival greater than any before. The canals were lit with thousands of lamps, and the air filled with the sound of lyres and flutes. Dancers moved across the bridges, their garments shimmering with metal thread. In the harbour, ships were strung with lanterns, their reflections rippling in the dark water. From the hills the light could be seen for miles, a constellation born upon the earth. In the middle of the celebration, a storm rose suddenly from the sea. The wind tore through the markets, scattering banners and extinguishing torches. Waves crashed against the harbour walls, and lightning struck the peaks of the outer temples. For hours the city trembled under rain and thunder. The people fled indoors, terrified. But when the dawn came, the sky cleared as quickly as it had darkened. Some said it was nothing, just the sea reminding them who ruled it. Others said it was a warning. Atlas said nothing at all. He climbed to the temple and laid his hands upon the pillar. The red metal was cold. The words inscribed there, words he had spoken 100 times before, felt heavy beneath his touch. He looked out over the rings of the city, the ships, the markets, the fields. It was all perfect, too perfect, the kind of perfection that could not last. He turned to the priests and whispered, "The sea is stirring again." They asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head. Far below, in the depths where light could not reach, the pressure of centuries was building. The seabed shifted just slightly, a groan so faint it might have been a sigh. The earth remembered what the gods had buried, and the gods, watching from their high places, began to speak of judgment. In the next part we'll watch the tide begin to turn, how the kings, blinded by their own triumph, reach beyond their shores to conquer the world, and how the sea begins to whisper of vengeance. The golden age of Atlantis could have lasted forever, or so the people believed. The sea was calm, the harvests rich, the temples full of song. Ships returned heavy with spices and gold, and the markets glittered beneath banners of silk. Yet perfection is a fragile thing, and the first cracks rarely appear in stone or metal. They begin in silence, in small ambitions spoken softly enough to sound harmless. It began with the princes, the grandsons of Atlas, born into comfort, raised in marble halls where even the air smelled of honey and cedar. They had never known the days when Poseidon's laws were recited before dawn, when a meal began with prayer, when every cup of wine was poured with gratitude to the sea. To them, those rituals belonged to a simpler, smaller age. They saw the ships returning from distant lands, Egypt, Libya, the Aegean, laden with goods, with stories, with tales of empires smaller and weaker than their own. The world, they decided, was ripe for conquest. At first their plans were hidden behind the language of trade. More ships, they said, would protect the merchants, more soldiers would secure the routes, more tribute from foreign shores would ensure stability. Their speeches were noble, persuasive, but their eyes shone with something that was not duty. Soon, the shipyards of Atlantis worked through the night. The sound of saws and hammers echoed across the outer rings like restless thunder. Great galleys were built, ships larger than any the island had seen before, their hulls plated in bronze, their sails woven from crimson and gold. On their prows were carved not the horses of Poseidon, but the faces of kings. The harbour became a forest of masts, each bearing the sigil of one of the 10 houses. The people watched in awe, proud of their strength. They told themselves that their father's humility had simply been the beginning of a longer story, that the gods had meant for Atlantis to rise above the world, not to live in its shadow. When the fleets were ready, the younger kings gathered in the Hall of Judgment beneath the painted ceiling of stars. Atlas, frail but still sharp-eyed, sat at the head of the council. "Brothers," said Menesius, the same who once questioned the pillar's purpose, "our forefathers built Atlantis to honor the gods, but the gods favor the bold. Why should our glory end at the horizon? The lands across the sea are waiting to be taught, guided, ruled. This is not arrogance, it is destiny." Atlas said nothing at first. He looked to each of his brothers, saw their eager faces, their fingers tracing the table's edge as though itching to seize the world. Then he rose, leaning on his staff. "Destiny," he said softly, "is only the name pride gives to its reflection." Menesius laughed, not in mockery, but in pity. "Then perhaps it is time for pride to lead. You have ruled long enough with caution. The sea has given us every gift. Why should we not give it back in tribute of our own, in conquest, in greatness?" Atlas stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "The sea does not ask for tribute, it asks for balance. You break that, and you break everything." But his words fell like stones into deep water, swallowed by the echo of ambition. That night, the kings voted. 8 of 10 raised their hands for expansion. The law still demanded unanimity, but the tide of opinion had turned. Atlas left the hall in silence, his sandals echoing against the marble floor. The pillar of law gleamed faintly behind him, as though lit from within. Within months, the first expeditions set sail. The galleys cut across the Atlantic like blades through silk, their oars flashing in the sun. They landed first on the islands nearest the mainland, places of forests and sand, where the people lived simply, trading fish and stone tools. The Atlanteans came bearing gifts, metal, wine, cloth, but when the gifts were refused, the swords came instead. It was swift, efficient, devastating. The smaller islands fell in days, their rulers bowed or vanished, their people taken as workers for the fields and mines of Atlantis. The victors told themselves it was order, not conquest. They said the gods must surely approve, for the winds filled their sails and the storms turned aside. Then they looked farther, to Egypt, to Greece, to the lands of the rising sun. The fleets grew bolder. They crossed the pillars of Heracles, claiming that even the boundary of the gods was not forbidden, but merely forgotten. In Athens, the philosophers wrote of strange ships that appeared on the horizon, ships unlike any they had seen, their sails blood-red, their hulls shining as though made of fire. The Atlanteans demanded tribute. The Greeks refused. What followed was not a war of vengeance, but a lesson in hubris. For the first time, Atlantis met an enemy that would not yield. The Athenians fought with unity and cunning. Their smaller ships darted between the great Atlantean galleys, cutting ropes, setting fires, luring them into narrow straits where their size became a burden. The sea, too, turned against its children, winds shifting, waves rising in strange patterns. When news of defeat reached the island, the people were stunned. The kings, once adored, faced quiet resentment. The markets grew tense. Trade faltered, ships vanished in storms that seemed to appear from nowhere. The harvest that year came late, and the springs, the warm and the cold, ran unevenly for the first time since anyone could remember. The priests said it was nothing. The younger kings said it was bad luck, but Atlas knew better. He walked again to the temple, alone as thunder rolled in the distance. The red pillar glowed faintly in the half-light, its inscriptions now dim and hard to read. He placed his hand upon it. For the first time, the metal felt warm, not the warmth of life, but the fever of warning. The ground beneath him trembled, subtle but steady, like the heartbeat of something vast awakening beneath the earth. He fell to his knees and whispered, "Father, forgive us." Outside, the rain began to fall. The streets filled with water. From the sea came a low, drawn-out sound. Not thunder, not wind, but something older. The fishermen along the harbor turned their heads toward the horizon, their faces pale. The tide had turned. In the next part we'll see how the gods answered that prayer, how the whispers of the sea grew into the roar of judgment, and how the first tremors of destruction began to shake the heart of Atlantis itself. The rain that fell on Atlantis that night did not stop for 3 days. It was not the gentle kind that nourished crops or cleaned the streets. It was relentless, cold, and strange, as though the sea itself had begun to weep. The canals swelled until their waters lapped over the bridges. Lightning clawed the sky, striking the bronze roofs, and echoing down the marble corridors like the footsteps of unseen gods. For a time the people told themselves it was only weather. The priests burned incense and prayed louder, as if smoke could drown out thunder. But beneath the sound of the storm another noise grew, low, deep, and rhythmic. It came not from the sky, but from the ground. The earth was shifting. In the upper hills, cracks opened in the red soil. Springs that had run for centuries changed their course overnight, flooding some fields and leaving others bone dry. The fishermen said the tides were moving wrong, pulling outward when they should have rolled in. Even the birds seemed confused, flying inland by the thousands before vanishing into the clouds. Atlas felt it first. He had taken to walking the temple at night, restless, unable to sleep through the sound of distant thunder. Each time he placed his hand on the pillar of law, he found it trembling faintly, a heartbeat growing stronger. The inscriptions that once shone clear were fading, the grooves filling with dust and ash. He ordered the priests to polish it daily, but no amount of care could restore its light. Down in the markets, the changes were subtler, but more dangerous. Trade ships were vanishing, not to pirates or war, but to the sea itself. A fleet bound for Egypt was lost without a trace. Its last signal carried on the wind, a deep boom, followed by silence. The merchants whispered that the gods were reclaiming what was theirs. The younger kings, desperate to keep order, forbade such talk. They told the people the seas were calm, that Atlantis was still blessed. They built new statues and held grand festivals to distract the crowds. But nature does not bend for spectacle. The rain turned to mist that clung to the city long after the storms passed. The once blue canals grew murky, their water thick with silt. The fishermen who cast nets near the outer harbor began to find strange things tangled in them, stones that glowed faintly, shards of coral blackened as though by fire. The sea was changing color. One night, a tremor struck so violently that the temple's great doors swung open on their own. The statue of Poseidon swayed, and a thin crack split the marble floor from the altar to the base of the pillar. It was not wide, but it was deep, deep enough that no one could see its end. The priests fell to their knees in fear, but Atlas only watched, silent. The next morning, he summoned the kings. They came reluctantly, traveling from their provinces through flooded fields and half-collapsed bridges. The council met in the dim light of the temple, where the air smelled faintly of metal and smoke. Atlas stood before them, older now, his hair white, his voice rough from years of salt and sleeplessness. "The sea is reclaiming its balance," he said. "We have broken the order. You can feel it. The springs are poisoned, the tides reversed. Even the air tastes different. The gods will not wait much longer." Mencius scoffed, though his voice wavered. "Old men see omens in every cloud. The world shifts. It always has. The storms will pass. We will rebuild. Atlas looked at him with quiet pity. You cannot rebuild what the gods intend to erase. Silence fell. The younger kings avoided his gaze. They had all seen the signs, the earthquakes, the dying fields, the cracks in their palaces, but none dared admit what they feared. Then the ground trembled again, hard enough to rattle the walls. Dust drifted from the ceiling, settling on the bronze floor. Somewhere far away, a roar echoed, not thunder, but the collapse of cliffs. The sea was devouring the edges of the island. When the tremor passed, Atlas spoke again. If any of you still honor the law of Poseidon, prepare, send the people inland, gather the sacred scrolls. Take nothing of gold or vanity, only the words, the sea will rise. But his warning was too late. In the outer rings, panic had already begun. The fishermen fled the harbors, abandoning their boats. Farmers ran from the plains as the canals overflowed, and the earth began to quake. Whole fields disappeared into sinkholes, swallowed as though the island itself were breathing in. The younger kings tried to keep control. They opened the granaries, promising safety, but the people no longer trusted words. Rumors spread faster than the wind, that the gods were angry, that Poseidon himself had risen from the deep, that the island was sinking. Then came the night. The sea turned black. It began at sunset. The horizon darkened faster than usual, not with storm clouds, but with a shadow rising from the water, a vast swell that rolled silently toward the shore. The wind died. Even the torches along the bridges burned straight, their flames motionless. For a heartbeat, the entire island seemed to hold its breath. And then the wave struck. It hit the outer ring first, tearing through the harbor walls and flinging ships into the air like toys. The sound was unlike anything the people had ever heard, not crashing but roaring, as though the ocean itself was shouting. The water poured through the canals, sweeping away markets, bridges, and homes. Atlas, standing at the temple, watched the flood race toward the inner ring. He could hear the screams, the breaking of stone, the tearing of timbers. He ordered the priests to seal the doors, but the force of the wave shattered them before they could move. Water filled the hall, swirling around the pillar, rising higher by the second. The priests clung to the statue of Poseidon, crying out his name. Atlas stood firm, his robes heavy with water, his hand pressed against the red metal. "You warned us," he whispered, "and we did not listen." The pillar pulsed once, a single flash of light, before the water rose over his head. When the sea withdrew, it left silence. The temples were gone. The harbors, the bridges, the rings, all vanished beneath the black water. Only the peaks of the highest hills remained, their tops gleaming like islands in a new sea. But the ocean was not finished. As dawn broke, a deep rumble echoed from the earth's core. The survivors looked up to see smoke and ash rising from the mountains, followed by fire. The air grew thick, the sky red. The ground buckled as if the island itself were folding inward. The gods, it seemed, had chosen not to drown Atlantis alone. They meant to erase it. And as the fire met the flood, the island began to disappear. In the next part, we'll witness the wrath of the gods in full. The night Atlantis vanished forever beneath the waves, and the world that remained above forgot, or tried to. By the time the first light broke across the horizon, Atlantis was no longer a city. It was a memory fighting to stay alive beneath a sky of ash. The sea had not receded. It had only paused, waiting like a living thing catching its breath. The survivors stood on the highest ridges, watching the horizon burn. The ocean that had once nourished them now moved with the patience of judgment. It rolled back and forth, each wave larger than the last, as if drawing strength from its own fury. The priests had spoken of divine anger in parables, of storms sent to humble pride. But this was no parable. The ground itself throbbed like a drumbeat from the underworld. Fissures tore through the plains where temples once stood, swallowing columns, statues, and men alike. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and salt. Birds fell from the sky, their wings coated in ash. No one knew where the other kings were, whether they had drowned, fled, or still clung to the fragments of their broken cities. In the temple's ruins, Atlas alone remained, half buried in the dark water, his hand still pressed to the fallen pillar. The orichalcum had dimmed to the color of blood, its once perfect surface fractured with glowing veins. Every few seconds, light pulsed through it, as though it still remembered its divine origin, a warning too late to be heard. And then came the voice. It was not sound as mortals know it, but a vibration that shook the marrow of every living thing. The survivors heard it in their bones, in the crashing of the waves, in the whisper of the wind through the smoke. The language was ancient, older than words, yet every heart understood it. Balance has been broken. The world must be cleansed. The sea answered. From the deep the waters rose again, not in one wave, but in a wall, vast and dark, stretching from horizon to horizon. It glowed faintly from within, lit by streaks of fire that twisted like veins of molten glass. Those who saw it could not even scream. The sound of it drowned every voice, every prayer, every memory. The wall of water struck the island with the weight of a mountain. The outer plains disappeared first, their fertile fields crushed into the sea's floor. Villages, markets and palaces were torn from the earth, as though made of straw. The canals that had once carried water with such perfect order now became the veins of destruction, directing the flood straight into the heart of the city. In moments the streets were gone. The red and black stones of the inner rings tumbled and collided, their edges ground smooth by the pressure of the waves. The temple of Poseidon, that masterpiece of faith and arrogance, cracked in two. Its roof fell inward, sending a column of foam and dust into the air. Atlas, still within the temple's ruins, lifted his head as the light dimmed around him. The statues of his ancestors were already gone, pulled down into the churning abyss. The red pillar flickered once more, as if to acknowledge him, then shattered into 1,000 shards. The fragments glowed briefly before being swept away into the depths, their light fading like embers in the dark. And with that, the god's covenant was broken. The storm that followed was unlike any the world had ever seen. The sky itself tore open. Fire rained down, not from the sun but from the mountains. Black stones that burned as they fell, hissing as they struck the water. Great plumes of steam rose where the sea met the molten rock. The smell was choking. Salt, smoke, and something metallic, like blood on iron. The survivors tried to climb higher, but there was no high ground left. The mountains groaned and split apart. Rivers of lava poured down their slopes, lighting the waves red. The air grew hot and heavy. Even the clouds seemed to burn. For a few brief moments before the final wave came, there was silence. The kind of silence that exists only when the world holds its breath. The people looked to the heavens and saw stars vanish behind smoke. The priests, kneeling on the cliffs, raised their hands not in plea, but in surrender. And then the earth opened. It split from the heart of the island outward, a jagged wound that bled fire and seawater. The sea rushed in to fill it, but the chasm was endless. The sound of the collapse echoed across the ocean, a groan so vast that sailors in distant lands claimed they heard it in their dreams. The waves rolled out from the dying island, racing toward the shores of Egypt, of Greece, of unknown continents beyond. In a single night and day, Atlantis was no more. The mountain peaks sank last, glowing briefly like candles before they were extinguished. The sea closed over them, leaving only foam and darkness. When the dawn came, there was nothing. No ruins, no smoke, not even a ripple, only the faint shimmer of the morning sun on a calm, endless ocean. Those who survived, a handful perhaps, were carried by the waves to distant shores. They spoke of their lost home in whispers, their memories half ruined by fear and grief. Some said the gods had cursed the island for its arrogance. Others claimed it was not punishment, but renewal, that the sea had reclaimed what had always been its own. The ocean remembers, they said, it never forgets, and deep beneath the calm surface, something remained. Far below where light could reach, beneath miles of water and silt, the ruins of Atlantis still glowed faintly, the last embers of Aurichalcum pulsing like a heartbeat. The city was gone, but its echo endured. Silent walls, buried temples, the outlines of streets carved in stone. The sea moved gently over them, as if mourning, and perhaps it was not the end, but the beginning of another story. For centuries later, sailors would tell tales of lights flickering beneath the waves on moonless nights, of voices carried on the tide, of music that rose and faded with the currents. They said the gods had not destroyed Atlantis entirely, only hidden it, preserving it for a time when men might once again remember humility. The world moved on, empires rose and fell. The story of the drowned island became myth, then legend, then philosophy. A caution whispered in marble halls, retold by men who never saw its glow, but felt its warning in their bones. And yet, the sea still holds secrets. Somewhere, beyond the pillars of Heracles, beyond the reach of maps, the deep trembles now and then, faintly, almost imperceptibly. The sailors who hear it say it sounds like a distant drumbeat, a slow, patient rhythm. Perhaps it is nothing more than the shifting of tectonic plates, the restless sleep of the earth, or perhaps, just perhaps, it is the echo of a god stirring once more beneath the waves, his patience thinning, his trident poised. The sea is quiet now, but quiet, as the Atlanteans learned too late, is not the same as peace. In the next part, we'll rise from the depths and into memory itself, to see how the legend of Atlantis survived across millennia, passed through ancient Egypt, and into the mind of a philosopher who gave the drowned world its name. When the waters finally stilled, the world above did not yet know what it had lost. The sea stretched unbroken, gleaming beneath the morning sun, as if no city had ever stood there at all. But memory is a strange thing. It lingers like salt in the air, like the echo of a wave long after it has fallen. Atlantis was gone, yet it had already begun to transform into something more enduring than stone. A story. The few who survived the destruction were scattered across distant shores, fishermen clinging to broken timbers, merchants carried east by the current, priests washed up among strangers who stared at them as if they had risen from the dead. They brought with them fragments of memory, stories told in pieces, their edges worn by grief. To some it was a tale of punishment, to others a promise that paradise once existed, but none could agree on where it had been, or why it had fallen. Each retelling changed the island a little more. One survivor, the story goes, reached the delta of the Nile. We do not know his name. The Egyptians called him the man from the sea. He was taken before the priests of Sais, keepers of ancient knowledge, men who believed that the past was written in the stars. When he spoke of his homeland, they listened in silence. His words were halting, as though the language itself was crumbling beneath the weight of memory. He spoke of a city that gleamed with red metal, of 10 kings bound by law, of floods and fire, and a night when the earth itself turned against them. The priests wrote his words upon clay tablets, marking each line with care, but even they doubted, for how could an island so vast, so powerful, vanish in a single day? They filed the records away, deep within their temple archives, beside the stories of gods and dynasties so old that even they had forgotten their names. And there the memory of Atlantis slept, not in the sea, but in the quiet halls of scholars. Centuries passed. The world changed, empires rose where deserts once lay, sailors traced new coastlines, the gods themselves were renamed, and still beneath it all, the sea whispered. It carried its secret across generations, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in myths that half remembered what had been. In Greece, long after the fall of the Mycenaeans, men began to look backward, to wonder who they had been before the wars, before the chaos of kings. Among them was a philosopher, whose mind never stopped seeking order in the patterns of the world. His name was Plato. He was not a sailor, or a priest. He had never seen the ocean beyond Athens, except as a distant shimmer from the hilltops. Yet something in him was drawn to it. The vastness, the mystery, the idea that the sea could hold a mirror to human nature itself. Plato's story of Atlantis did not come to him in a vision, nor from the gods, but from history, or at least what passed for it in his time. He wrote that the tale had been passed down from Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, who had once journeyed to Egypt seeking wisdom. There, Solon had spoken with the priests of Sais, who told him of an empire that had risen in the Atlantic and fallen 9,000 years before his time. The priests said Athens had once defeated this empire when it tried to conquer the world, and that afterward the sea swallowed the island as punishment for its arrogance. Plato recorded this tale in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. But he did something extraordinary. He treated it not as a fable but as a record. He described the geography, the laws, the gods, the abundance, and finally the fall. He even included the smallest details, the exact width of the rings of water and land, the minerals that shone in the walls, the names of the kings. To him, Atlantis was not simply a city, it was a symbol, a warning that even the most enlightened civilization could destroy itself if it forgot humility. He used the myth to teach his students that human virtue was not measured in wealth or power, but in balance, in obedience to what he called the harmony of the cosmos. And yet, there is something haunting in how he wrote of it. The story ends abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the memory itself were breaking apart again. No explanation, no closure, just a sudden silence, as if the sea had reclaimed the words even as he wrote them. Some say Plato intended to finish the tale but died before he could. Others believe he left it unfinished on purpose, a mystery to pull the reader toward reflection rather than certainty. Whatever his reason, the world never forgot the fragment he left behind. The philosophers debated it, the poets adorned it, and centuries later, the explorers went searching for it. Each age reshaped Atlantis in its own image. To some, it was proof that paradise once existed, and might again. To others, it was a caution that every empire, no matter how radiant, carries within it the seed of its own ruin. In time, the details blurred. Was it in the Atlantic, as Plato said, or beneath the Mediterranean? Was it an island, or a continent? Some claimed it was hidden beneath the sands of the Sahara, buried when the seas retreated. Others said it lay near the icy poles, preserved beneath frozen waves. Every theory revealed less about the island, and more about those who sought it, their desires, their fears, their longing to touch something that felt divine. But beneath all the speculation, the core of the story remained unchanged. A people who rose higher than any before them, who mastered the gifts of nature and defied the gods, and who paid for that defiance in a single night of water and flame. It is a story older than any map, older even than Plato's pen. It is the echo of a truth humans have always known, that the sea gives, and the sea takes away. Still, one mystery lingers. How could Plato, a man born thousands of years after the supposed fall, describe Atlantis in such vivid detail? The names, the measures, the laws, all too precise to be invention. Did he uncover something the world had long forgotten? Did Solon's Egyptian priests truly preserve a memory that old, or, and this is the thought that has kept scholars awake for centuries, does memory itself stretch further than we think? Could it be that somewhere deep in the human spirit, stories like Atlantis are not just inventions, but remnants of things once known, dimly remembered in dreams? Every civilization has its flood myth, every culture its warning about pride, its tale of a world washed clean by water. Perhaps all of them are reflections of the same event, seen through different eyes, retold by those who survived. And if that's true, then Atlantis is not gone. It lives wherever we speak its name, in every story that wonders what might lie beneath the calm surface of the sea. But legends have a way of awakening when the world least expects it, because every few generations, someone hears the call again, a voice beneath the waves, a flash of red light in the depths, and the search begins anew. In the next part, we'll follow that search, from ancient Egypt to Renaissance Europe, from philosophers to explorers, as the dream of Atlantis rises again and draws humanity back toward the mystery that never truly sank. Centuries passed, and the sea kept its silence. The tides rolled endlessly over the place where Atlantis once stood, smooth and unbroken, as if to hide every trace of the world it had consumed. But stories, unlike cities, do not drown so easily. They travel through the minds of men, carried by voices, reshaped by time, refusing to be forgotten. In Egypt, the priests of Sais guarded their old records, tablets inscribed with the strange tale of a drowned empire. Few ever read them. Dynasties rose and fell, conquerors came and went, but the story survived, hidden in dusty halls and whispered among scholars who claimed that the sea had once swallowed the pride of kings. When the Greeks inherited that story through Plato, it became a mirror for philosophy. When the Romans took it, it became a metaphor for empire, a warning that no dominion, no matter how vast, could escape the gravity of its own ambition. And when Rome itself fell, burned and divided, the story of Atlantis slipped quietly into legend, drifting like a half-remembered dream through the ruins of history. For nearly 1,000 years, the world forgot how to listen to the sea. The Dark Ages closed around Europe like fog. Scholars copied what few books survived, fragments of Aristotle, whispers of Plato, and even those were read more as curiosities than truths. The oceans, vast and terrifying, became borders of the known world. Men drew maps where sea monsters guarded the edges, where the deep was not an invitation but a warning. Yet the story endured. It survived in monasteries, in manuscripts, hidden beneath candlelight. It slept in the minds of sailors who stared at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond. And when the Renaissance dawned, when the hunger for lost knowledge rekindled, Atlantis awoke with it. In Florence, in the 15th century, scholars rediscovered Plato's dialogues. The ancient words, newly translated, spread like wildfire across Europe. Philosophers debated whether the tale was allegory or history. Theologians wondered if it predated the great flood of Noah. Explorers began to whisper that the island might still exist, waiting to be found. The old maps, once decorative fantasies, became invitations. Atlantis was reborn, not as a moral parable, but as a mystery. The Renaissance world was obsessed with rediscovery. The printing press had given men the power to spread ideas faster than kingdoms could control them. The age of exploration was dawning. Sailors were preparing to cross oceans no one had dared to map, and suddenly, the legend of a vast land beyond the Pillars of Heracles no longer seemed like fiction. It felt like prophecy. In 1492, as Columbus set sail westward, he carried with him more than navigational charts and ambition. He carried the ghost of Atlantis. Many in his time believed he might find its remnants. The western lands Plato had described. When he reached the Caribbean, he wrote in his journals that the islands seemed like the world of the ancients reborn. He had not found Atlantis, but the dream had driven him across the edge of the known world. After Columbus, the search became an obsession. The Spanish and Portuguese explorers, fueled by equal parts faith and greed, spoke of golden cities, lost continents, and civilizations swallowed by the sea. They dug through jungles, mapped coastlines, and sent divers into shallow reefs, convinced they were walking on the bones of the drowned world. In the centuries that followed, the legend evolved again. The Enlightenment gave it reason. Science gave it form. Scholars began to look for geological proof, signs of a sunken continent, volcanic eruptions, or shifting plates that could explain how a civilization might vanish. The philosopher Francis Bacon imagined Atlantis not as a cautionary tale, but as a utopia, a place of wisdom where science and morality existed in harmony. His book, The New Atlantis, transformed the lost city into a symbol of human potential, not divine punishment, but divine inspiration. Artists and writers followed. Painters depicted marble domes rising from turquoise seas. Poets dreamed of golden statues buried beneath coral. Every era painted its own Atlantis, part history, part longing. The Victorians, obsessed with archaeology and empire, scoured the world for evidence. Expeditions searched the Mediterranean, the Azores, the Sahara, even the frozen edges of Antarctica. Every discovery of an ancient ruin, every odd artifact, every rumor of a vanished culture reignited the hope that the myth was true. And always, at the center of it was Plato, the quiet voice from Athens, whose unfinished words had outlived empires. Scholars argued endlessly. Had he invented it to teach a lesson? Had he recorded a memory passed down through Egypt from some prehistoric age? Or had he glimpsed something deeper, an echo from a world the sea had erased, but not silenced? Even scientists, centuries later, could not let it go. In the 19th century, when geology was young and the sea still mysterious, some claimed to have found proof of a sunken landmass in the Atlantic, a ridge of mountains stretching beneath the waves. They called it the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. To them it was evidence that Plato's tale was rooted in truth. To others it was coincidence, nothing more. Yet the question remained, persistent as the tide: what if it was real? The 20th century brought new technology. Sonar, submarines, satellites. The ocean floor, once invisible, began to reveal its secrets. And though no city of marble appeared, strange patterns emerged, symmetrical ridges, unnatural formations, ruins that shouldn't exist. Each discovery sparked another wave of speculation. Perhaps the Atlantic was not the resting place, but the memory of something larger, a lost chapter of human civilization, erased by time and water. And through it all, the story continued to evolve, from myth to science, from allegory to obsession. Each age remade Atlantis in its own image, but one thing never changed: the yearning it awakened. The story of a lost perfection, punished for pride, still speaks to something deep in the human heart. We build, we rise, we forget, and then we search for what we've lost. But what if the search itself is part of the story? What if Atlantis was never meant to be found, because the moment we find it, the myth ends, and the mirror it holds up to us disappears? Even now, explorers scan the ocean floor, archaeologists sift through sand and coral, and dreamers still look west at sunset, wondering if the horizon hides more than sky. Some swear they've heard things beneath the waves, a distant hum, a vibration, like a heartbeat in the deep. Perhaps it's the shifting of tectonic plates, or perhaps it's something older, the memory of a city that refuses to die completely, pulsing faintly in the darkness, waiting to be remembered once more. Because every few centuries the world seems to tilt, and myths have a way of surfacing when humanity needs their warning most. And now, as our own age builds towers that touch the clouds, as our machines whisper to the stars, one can't help but wonder, are we listening to the same quiet hum the Atlanteans once ignored? In the next part, we'll step into the modern age, where science, imagination, and belief collide, and uncover how Atlantis transformed from a forgotten parable into a symbol that defines our endless hunger for discovery and our fear of what happens when we go too far. By the dawn of the 20th century, Atlantis had escaped the realm of myth and stepped boldly into the world of modern imagination. It no longer lived solely in Plato's pages or the dusty scrolls of priests. It had become a riddle for scientists, a dream for artists, and a promise for those who believed humanity had once touched the divine. The lost city wasn't simply a story anymore. It was a challenge, one whispered by the sea itself. The age of exploration had given way to an age of discovery. Submarines, sonar, and science began to peel back the ocean's surface. For the first time, humanity could look into the abyss that had swallowed its oldest legends. And as the maps of the seafloor slowly emerged, the belief in Atlantis only grew stronger. In 1882, the American congressman and writer Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, a book that would ignite a global obsession. Donnelly claimed that Atlantis was not a myth, but the cradle of all civilization, the source of every ancient culture, every lost technology, every shared legend of flood and fire. His words captured the restless spirit of his time, a century when science and faith still wrestled for control of truth. He argued that when Atlantis sank, its survivors scattered across the world, carrying fragments of its wisdom to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. To many, Donnelly was a visionary. To others, he was a dreamer chasing shadows. But his book spread faster than skepticism. By the turn of the century, the lost city had become a cultural fever. Newspapers printed stories of explorers heading west to seek the ruins of the gods. Spiritualists claimed to channel Atlantean souls. Theosophists like Helena Blavatsky spoke of a forgotten race, the Atlanteans, who had wielded powers that blended science and magic, destroyed by their own hubris. In parlors lit by candlelight, mediums whispered of crystal towers and floating ships, of beings who spoke to the stars. The world was changing rapidly. Electricity hummed in cities, machines replaced muscle, and humankind felt closer to mastering nature than ever before. In that rising hum of progress, Atlantis became a symbol, both of human greatness and human danger. If an ancient civilization could rise higher than any before it, only to fall beneath its own ambition, then perhaps history itself was a warning written in waves. The 20th century carried the myth even further. Archaeologists found ancient cities buried in the sands, Troy, Mycenae, Knossos, proving that some myths could indeed hide truth. If those legends had been real, why not Atlantis? Each discovery made the impossible feel a little less impossible. Explorers searched the Azores, the coast of Spain, the Caribbean. When the first sonar images of the ocean floor revealed vast symmetrical ridges, they were hailed as proof, the bones of a continent long lost. In 1939, Edgar Cayce, the American sleeping prophet, gave Atlantis a new destiny. In his trance-like readings, he claimed that the island had used advanced technology, energy harnessed from crystals, and that parts of it still rested beneath the sea near the Bahamas. He predicted that fragments of Atlantis would one day rise again, emerging from the depths as a reminder of humanity's forgotten past. For decades, believers clung to his words. Expeditions combed the Caribbean, pointing to strange underwater formations like the Bimini Road, claiming it was a causeway built by the Atlanteans themselves. At the same time, Atlantis began to seep into popular culture, not as philosophy, but as spectacle. Novels, comic books, and films reimagined the lost city as everything from a futuristic utopia to a cautionary wasteland. It became a stage on which every generation projected its own fears and desires. To some, it was proof that mankind could achieve greatness beyond imagination. To others, it was a reminder that all greatness comes at a cost. Then came the scientific age, the deep-sea dives, the satellites, the underwater cameras. The more technology advanced, the deeper we looked, the more we found, the more the mystery deepened. Geological evidence began to suggest that massive floods and shifting plates had indeed reshaped the Earth thousands of years ago. Volcanic eruptions, like the one that destroyed the island of Thera, modern Santorini, showed that entire civilizations could vanish beneath the sea, and suddenly, the myth no longer felt like fantasy. Scholars began to draw parallels between Plato's story and real events: the eruption of Thera, the fall of the Minoans, the earthquakes that tore apart Crete and the Aegean. The shapes matched. The timeline, almost, perhaps Atlantis had not been across the Atlantic at all, but hidden closer, beneath the familiar waters of the Mediterranean. Others argued that the myth was far older still, a memory from a time before history, passed through generations until Plato gave it words. Even in the face of science, belief persisted. For every skeptic who declared the story symbolic, another dreamer stood ready to dive. In the 1960s and 70s, underwater explorers filmed ruins off the coast of Spain and Morocco, claiming they had found the concentric rings described by Plato himself. When sonar detected what appeared to be massive walls beneath the Atlantic, the legend surged again. Each discovery, each new photograph, pulled the myth back into the light. By the dawn of the digital age, Atlantis had found new life in pixels and algorithms. The internet turned the myth into a global conversation. Satellite imagery revealed strange shapes on the ocean floor. Enthusiasts across the world compared maps, plotted theories, built virtual reconstructions. Atlantis became an idea that anyone could explore, not a place confined by coordinates, but a symbol accessible to everyone with curiosity and a screen. And maybe that is where its true power lies. Because even after millennia of searching, we still don't know whether Atlantis was ever real, and perhaps we never will. But the hunger to find it tells us something about ourselves. We are a species that cannot bear the thought of forgetting. We dig through the ruins of our past to understand who we are, and in doing so we keep the past alive. Maybe Atlantis is not a lost city, but a reflection of every civilization that ever believed itself immortal. A mirror held up by time, warning us that progress without wisdom is simply another tide waiting to turn. Yet even as we speak of it in symbols, the sea continues to stir. New sonar scans, new ruins uncovered in the depths, new seismic anomalies. Each discovery whispers the same question: what if? What if? Beneath the weight of time and water, something still waits. Not the ruins of a moral tale, but the remnants of a real world. An echo of humanity's first rise, still breathing in the dark. And if the sea one day pulls back again, if the tides reveal even a single fragment of that lost empire, will we finally understand the lesson it left behind? Or will we, like those who came before, mistake discovery for dominion? Because every story that resurfaces from the deep carries a choice to listen or to repeat. And as the world grows louder with machines, with power, with pride, there are nights when the ocean hums louder than all of it, as though it remembers something we've forgotten, something stirring, something patient, something waiting. In the final part, we'll return to the present, to the thin line between myth and truth, and ask the question that still echoes through every age: What if Atlantis was never meant to be found, because it was never truly lost? The sea is older than memory, and it remembers everything, every storm, every silence, every word ever whispered to its surface. It holds them, endlessly circling, reshaping them into songs that only the patient can hear. And perhaps that's where Atlantis has lived all along, not in the depths of the ocean, but in the depths of memory itself. In the modern world, we map every coastline, trace every current, and photograph the sea floor from space. We have names for every ridge, every trench, every island that rises from the waves. Yet, for all our knowledge, we are still haunted by the one place that will not show itself. The place that hums softly beneath everything we know, as if the sea itself is keeping a secret. Scientists, historians, and dreamers still search. Each believes they are closer than the last. The expedition ships of today glide silently over the Atlantic, their radar beams piercing the deep. Submersibles drift like ghosts between canyons of stone. Sonar maps reveal strange patterns, circular formations, geometric ridges, each one sparking the same question that has followed us for millennia. Could it be? And sometimes, they find things that refuse to be explained. Vast stone blocks buried in silt, ancient shorelines, hundreds of meters below the waves, traces of human presence where none should exist, artifacts out of time, a fragment of pottery, a pattern of walls. Each discovery sends a ripple through the imagination. Perhaps the sea isn't empty after all. Perhaps it remembers more than it lets on. But even now the debate continues. To the scholars, Atlantis remains an allegory, a moral reflection of human pride, Plato's mirror for civilization's soul. To the explorers, it is a real place waiting to be uncovered, proof that our history is far older, far deeper than we dare to believe. Between them lies a tension older than the story itself, the pull between meaning and mystery, because Atlantis, more than anything, has become a measure of us, our need to believe that we once touched greatness, and our fear that we will lose it again. It is the story of what happens when progress outruns wisdom, and in every age that grows too proud, the myth rises again like the tide, whispering its warning through the centuries. Yet for all the searching, maybe the truth was never meant to rest in the sand or stone. Maybe Atlantis was not a place to be found, but a lesson meant to be felt. Look around our own world now, the glittering cities on the coastlines, the towers of glass rising above the sea. We live, as they did, in an age of wonder. We split the atom, speak to the stars, build machines that learn. The oceans warm, the storms grow stronger, and still we tell ourselves that we are immune to collapse. We call ourselves modern, but our fears are ancient. We live in a reflection of Atlantis every day, a world of brilliance standing on fragile ground, pretending not to hear the distant rumble beneath it. If the Atlanteans were destroyed not by gods but by their own imbalance, their hunger, their forgetting, then their story is not mythology, it's prophecy, a memory that replays whenever humanity reaches too high and forgets to look down. And yet, there is something comforting in that idea too, that the story remains, repeating itself to remind us that we can choose differently, that maybe every civilization gets a chance to hear the echo before the tide comes again. Because there is something deeply human in our fascination with lost worlds. We build myths from ruins not just to mourn them but to believe that nothing truly vanishes, that what is good, what is wise, what is beautiful will find a way to rise again. Even if buried in silt, even if forgotten for 1,000 years, the sea eventually gives back what it takes. It always does. Imagine, then, that somewhere in the deepest part of the Atlantic, beyond light, beyond time, there still lies the faint outline of that vanished city, not crumbled, not gone, but sleeping. The red metal pillar, cold and dark, now, waiting. The marble walls covered in coral and memory. The sound of the tide moving through the empty canals, slow and steady, like the breath of something not quite dead. Perhaps one day, far in the future, another world will rise, another people will stand above the ocean and listen. And maybe, on a night of perfect stillness, they'll hear a sound beneath the waves, a hum like a heartbeat, old and patient. They'll call it coincidence, or current, or seismic tremor. But those who listen closely will know. It's not the sea moving, it's the story, turning over again. because stories like tides never end. They just return. So tonight, as the waves outside your window rise and fall, let the story of Atlantis settle softly in your mind. Let it remind you that nothing truly disappears, that every world, every dream, every memory still exists somewhere, waiting for someone to remember it. And as you drift towards sleep, imagine the sea quieting once more, its surface calm, its secrets hidden. Above it, the stars gleam like scattered fragments of the lost city, faint reflections of all that once was. For now, Atlantis sleeps beneath them, not as ruin, not as warning, but as promise. A promise that the next time humanity builds its great ringed cities, it might remember to build them with humility, to balance wonder with wisdom, power with grace, and perhaps, if we listen closely, we might hear the ocean whispering again, not in anger this time, but in forgiveness. Because even the sea, eternal and vast, loves what it destroys. It remembers every name, every dream, every empire that dared to reach too high, and every soul that ever looked across its endless blue and wondered what lay beyond. And maybe, one night, long after we're gone, when the stars burn low and the earth grows quiet, the waves will pull back, and the lost city will rise once more, gleaming in the dawn like it never sank at all. The story ends where it began, with a whisper from the deep. But perhaps, just perhaps, that whisper isn't the end. It's the beginning of the next civilization's dream. From the whispers of Plato's pen to the roar of the sea that swallowed it whole, the story of Atlantis remains one of humanity's most enduring mirrors, a tale of brilliance, balance, and inevitable loss. Once a city of divine harmony, Atlantis rose from Poseidon's love and the labor of his sons, only to be undone by pride and greed. Its fall echoed through centuries, carried by survivors, remembered by priests, reborn by philosophers, and reimagined by every age that followed. Whether a real place buried beneath the waves, or a lesson carved into the soul of humankind, Atlantis reminds us of a timeless truth. Every civilization is built on both creation and caution. The sea took the city, but not its story, and as long as we dream, the whisper of Atlantis will never truly fade. If you've enjoyed this journey through myth, memory, and mystery, let the candle keep burning by subscribing to Candlelit History. Every week we bring you another story told in the quiet hours, from forgotten empires to unsolved legends, from the echoes of the ancient world to the mysteries still hidden beneath our feet. Your support helps this little flame reach more dreamers, historians, and night thinkers around the world. So if this story of Atlantis stirred something in you, curiosity, wonder, or even a shiver, tap like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that history is more than dates and ruins. It's a living dream. And now, we'd love to hear from you. What story should we tell next? Would you like to drift through the lost libraries of Alexandria, walk the silent streets of Pompeii, or uncover the forgotten empires of the Amazon? Leave your ideas below. Your suggestion might just become our next midnight voyage through time. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, history never dies. It only waits to be rediscovered.